23-year-old Norwegian student Martine Vik Magnussen was killed in an apartment near Mayfair.
23-year-old Martine Vik Magnussen was found partially buried in the basement.
Before being questioned, the only suspect in the case had fled the UK to Yemen. I made a promise to Martina's family to find out what happened. Murder in Mayfair, part of the documentary. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
You're listening to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Gary O'Donoghue. One question, 4 expert witnesses and an answer.
15 years ago, 23-year-old Norwegian student Martine Vik Magnussen was killed in an apartment near Mayfair.
23-year-old Martine Vik Magnussen was found partially buried in the basement.
Before being questioned, the only suspect in the case had fled the UK to Yemen. I made a promise to Martina's family to find out what happened. Murder in Mayfair, part of the documentary. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
You're listening to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Gary O'Donoghue. One question, 4 expert witnesses and an answer. On November the 1st last year, Israel held its 5th general election in less than 4 years. This time, the vote produced a coalition government, more right-wing and more religious than any other in Israel's 75-year history. At its head, Benjamin Netanyahu, the great political survivor facing several corruption charges, but about to embark on his 6th term as the country's prime minister.
I hear the opposition's constant laments about the end of the state, the end of democracy. Members of the opposition, losing the elections is not the end of democracy. This is the essence of democracy.
But then this happened. Tens of thousands of people came onto the streets, all furious at radical changes being proposed to the power of Israel's Supreme Court. They were also angered by plans for a bigger role for religion in public life, leading many to fear an erosion of civil rights. And those demonstrations have continued, grown in size and become more organised and better funded. So this week on The Inquiry, we're asking, why is Israel in turmoil?
Part 1. A move to the right.
The nature of Israeli democracy, with its system of proportional representation, means all governments are coalitions. Until now, that has mainly meant agreements between centre-left and centre-right parties, with those at the far ends of the spectrum enjoying some occasional influence. But in November, the voters delivered a very different result.
What we saw was a weakening of the left and strengthening of the right.
Tamar Herman is a senior researcher at the Israel Democracy Institute and a professor of political science. She says the strong showing of 2 ultra-Orthodox parties and the 14 seats won by 2 parties from the far right actually produced a more coherent government than Israel has seen in the past.
And this is why they actually started full speed ahead to change some basic issues of the regime in Israel, where they're more, hesitant because they felt that there were cracks within this coalition. They might have been more cautious, but as they felt that they are actually seeing things from the same perspective and aiming at the same aims, they had no hesitation because they didn't expect such a protest to come out of the defeated political camp.
So what was it that galvanised that defeated political camp to such radical action on Israel's streets? In the main, it was a proposed overhaul of the country's Supreme Court, long seen as a liberal bastion by those on the right. The new government wanted to give the Knesset, or Parliament, greater powers to override the court's decisions. Opportunities for judicial review were to be curtailed, and the government planned to take more control over judicial appointments.
In essence, what the government tried to do is to have only one branch of government, because the parliament, the Knesset, is already very weak compared to the executive branch. And now they wanted the courts also to be weakened to the extent where they couldn't really oppose anything.
The sheer scale of the protests forced a pause in the changes. The defence minister was sacked over his opposition to the plans, but then reinstated. And the country's Attorney General accused Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of breaking the law by proposing the overhaul at the same time as he's being prosecuted for corruption. All of which produced a political diversity of opposition on Israel's streets unseen before. Not just the defeated left, but people from all walks of life, including military reservists and, famously, elite Air Force pilots.
For example, the pilots, they said that if the government will bash the Supreme Court, they might be susceptible to decision of international tribunals, which thus far have relied on the Supreme Court of Israel to be dealing with issues that might be against international law. And so the fact that these people appeared in these demonstrations, these were signs to people that this is something that crosses almost all boundaries in Israeli political map.
The sheer breadth of the opposition came as a surprise to the government, and while the protests were allowed to go ahead, Prime Minister Netanyahu set out to discredit those voices.
But Netanyahu himself, he did his best in order to present the protesters as non-patriotic, as traitors, as anarchists, as people who actually are aiming at destroying the state. What he actually said, if your economic situation is going to worsen, it is not because of what the government is doing, it is because of these protesters who are jeopardizing Israel's economic stability because of their distorted understanding of the judicial reform is meant to achieve.
But has Israel's great political survivor bitten off more than he can chew this time around? Will this unprecedented fracture in Israeli society mark the end of Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister?
Part 2. The Great Survivor.
Netanyahu is a lightning rod and he's a target. But what's interesting about what's happening in this government is this government has produced many targets for the protesters. And what's happening here is Netanyahu is not just a target. He is seen as someone who's brought in so many people who a large part of Israeli society think should not be in power. And it's almost like Netanyahu and the band at this point. So he is obviously a target, but there are many targets around him. It's a bit like a dartboard at this point.
Anshel Pfeffer is a widely published journalist and the author of a notable biography of Benjamin Netanyahu. He says when Netanyahu lost the job in 2021, many predicted he wouldn't come back, particularly as he was and still is facing serious fraud and bribery charges.
There are two cases in which Netanyahu is accused of having conspired in various ways with the owners of large news organizations in Israel to get them to commit to favorable coverage in return for Netanyahu helping them out in regulatory issues. And there's a third case in which Netanyahu is accused of having received illegal gifts from very wealthy business people to a tune of around £150,000, mainly gifts which were intended for his wife, expensive champagne and jewelry, and also Cuban cigars for himself.
Mr. Netanyahu denies the charges, and the fact that the case is ongoing has in no way prevented him from returning to the centre of Israeli politics, though it has clearly limited his options.
His party and the parties on the far right and the religious parties who support him were not enough until this fifth election, which was held in last November. They weren't enough for a majority, and other parties, more centrist parties, who in the past would have been prepared to join a coalition led by Netanyahu, have now said, we're not going to serve in a government which is led by a man who has been indicted for bribery and fraud and is currently on trial.
And it's not only limited his choices in political partners, it's also hemmed him in on policy.
Netanyahu in the past has been very good at forming coalitions and being able to maneuver between the parties. And when there were more radical demands from some of the coalition partners, he could say, well, we're in a coalition, we can't all do what we want. And in this current coalition, the parties are much more cohesive, much more radical. And even if Netanyahu wants to not necessarily go along with everything that they say, and we don't even know that's the case, but even if he would, it's very difficult for him to say no to his partners at this point.
So Benjamin Netanyahu is playing the hand he's been dealt, whether he agrees with the overhaul of the Supreme Court or not. But there's clearly been some kind of miscalculation, since the sheer ferocity and extent of the protests have surprised not just Israelis, but the whole world.
They didn't really make any real effort to try and explain it to the Israeli public. And since we know Netanyahu for so many years has been this communications genius, someone with his finger on the Israeli pulse, someone who knows how to sell ideas like few other politicians, not just in Israel, but anywhere in the world, the fact that he doesn't seem to have made much of an effort to sell this has been mystifying to many.
So what could explain such a miscalculation on Benjamin Netanyahu's part? A man who spent more time as Israel's prime minister than anyone else and dominated the country's politics for almost 3 decades.
There are two explanations. One is that he didn't really want this and it was something foisted upon him by the more radical elements of his coalition. But I think there's a better explanation that Netanyahu, until now, never really showed much of an interest in constitutional affairs. Netanyahu's interested in security, in diplomacy, in macroeconomics. Those are the issues that he's really good at. And this was something that he'd never really dealt with before. And it seems that he thought that it was a mere technical issue, some changes in the judicial arrangement. He certainly was surprised at the level of opposition amongst the Israeli public to this.
The issues of security and diplomacy have had to go on the back burner for now, with all the government's efforts and time consumed by the current crisis. But security is never far from the top of the agenda in Israeli politics.
Part 3. The Palestinian Question.
Negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians have stalled for years. Talk of a two-state solution, a dim and distant memory. Stalemate, if that's what it is however a deadly one, with frequent violent flare-ups and simmering tensions and conflict at Jerusalem's holy sites. So with the advent of this ultra-religious right-wing coalition, what are its plans for the occupied territories? Professor Yossi Meckelberg is an associate fellow at the Chatham House think tank in London.
For now, they are engaged mainly with what happened internally in Israel because they were caught what they call judicial reform, and those who oppose it see it as anti-democratic move to weaken the judiciary, see it as a judiciary coup. So this caught them also, the resistance to it caught them by surprise. We know what's at least the far right, the ultra-nationalistic, messianic elements within this government would like. They would like to expand settlements, to legalize the outposts, which are the settlements that even the Israeli government regard as illegal, to legalize them and then to develop them. And for some of them, the solution is actually annexation, at least the vast majority of the West Bank, if not all of the West Bank.
But there is a connection between the overhaul of the Supreme Court and the Palestinian question, according to Professor Meckelberg.
Their view is first, also in relations to the Palestinians, there is a need to weaken the Supreme Court because they see the Supreme Court as the one that stops them to do whatever they see fit inside Israel, but also vis-à-vis the Palestinians. So they enter into a blitz of legislation, more than 144 pieces of legislation in a matter of weeks, and they encounter resistance that they didn't expect. So whether they had a plan also to move in the West Bank and Gaza or not, They just couldn't continue that.
The coalition, he says, has made it harder for itself to take steps in areas like the West Bank because among the protesters have been large numbers of Israeli military reservists, a crucial part of the country's security apparatus. But while the reservists and others are concerned about the Supreme Court, the protesters have not directly focused on the Palestinian issue, leaving a good deal of uncertainty about what will happen if the coalition gets through its current troubles. Professor Meckelberg says the Palestinians are looking on in perplexity over the possible impact on them.
On the one hand, they see a government that poses real dangers to them. And they know that if this government actually gets over the current crisis in Israel, the next thing is more settlers, more settlements, more land grab, and with it probably kiss the final goodbye to a two-state solution if this option is still on the table. On the other hand, they look at what's happened in Israel and see there is also a chance that this government won't survive for much longer. What is going to happen next? Should they, for instance, stay at this moment and leave the processes within Israel, the political process, the demonstration, make a change there? Having said that, most Palestinians don't really believe that whether it's one government or another is going to make a huge difference.
And in the meantime, the international community seems to have largely disengaged from any attempts to keep the two parties talking, instead restricting its ambitions to encouraging calm when the flare-ups take place.
At most, they play a role of trying to limit the damage and of conflict management. As long as there is no missiles flying from one side to the other, air raids that destroy entire communities, they're happy to stay away. There is a sense in the international community, when we talk about the international community, mainly the United States, but also the European Union, that the peace process try to revive it. It's like flogging a dead horse, and they won't get engaged with that.
But the focus of the international community is not just on the Palestinian issue. The demonstrations have raised real questions in foreign capitals about Israel's reputation as a democracy. And with shifting alliances in the region also posing new challenges, everyone is being forced to reassess the geopolitics of the Middle East.
Part 4. Shifting Alliances.
The upheaval inside Israel has come at a delicate time for the country's position regionally. There has been a degree of normalization with some Arab states, but other new alliances are being forged, and it's all happening while the coalition's attention is taken up with the internal battles. Hugh Lovett is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Certainly in Western countries, those countries that have traditionally been much more supportive of Israel, it's fair to say there has been a growing concern and indeed alarm about recent developments in Israel surrounding the efforts of the Israeli government to overhaul the judiciary. And so if you take the US, for example, the US has long been a firm supporter of Israel. And when it comes to Israeli policies in other domains, such as Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, for example, the US government, US politicians have tended to be rather mute when it comes to their criticism, so that generally they've held back in forcefully criticizing Israel. But actually here, because a lot of people see the current crisis in Israel as a constitutional crisis, as something that is almost existential to Israel and to its future as a democratic country, we've actually seen these strong supporters of Israel much more vocal in their criticism of what's happening. And I think that just shows their concern about the potential direction in which this is going.
But it's not just Israel's staunch allies that are concerned with the current internal instability. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE have sought to normalise relations with Israel in recent years, and the policies and actions of the coalition could threaten that rapprochement.
Now, I don't think that growing tension in the bilateral relation is in itself purely about the internal constitutional crisis that Israel is facing. I think, to be quite clear, if you're Saudi Arabia or the UAE or other countries that are in the process to varying extents of normalizing the relationship with Israel, that probably doesn't matter as much. What really matters is how the Israeli government, how Israel behaves on foreign policy issues that are of importance to these Arab countries. This government has been taking an extremely hardline approach to the Palestinians, both in terms of how it's responding to escalating violence in the West Bank, but also perhaps more critically from the point of view of other Arab countries, how Israel is approaching the situation on the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount, which houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is of particularly important significance to Islam. And so over the last few weeks, for example, we've seen a number of videos that have been on social media, that have been widely shared in Arab social media, of Israeli security forces using disproportionate violence to expel Muslim worshippers from Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holy period of Ramadan. And this kind of image is, I think, very difficult for Muslim audiences, including those in Arab capitals, to watch.
There's also the question of Iran. Containing its nuclear program has long been the key focus of Israeli foreign policy. And despite differences over how best to pursue that, Israel needs to keep the United States on side in that endeavour. But the constitutional crisis has, in the view of some, led to Israel losing sight of this and other key regional objectives.
If you're sitting in Washington, clearly there is this sense of deep concern about what's happening domestically in Israel. But perhaps there's also a degree of frustration directed at the Israeli government that the Israeli government, that Netanyahu, has allowed things to get so out of hand domestically that this is getting in the way of joint US-Israeli efforts to address, again, whether that's the situation in the West Bank, with the Palestinians, or regionally with Iran.
In 2008, 23-year-old Norwegian student Martina Vik Magnussen went missing after a night out with friends in London.
I wonder what on earth could have happened.
We were so obsessed with just finding her.
Then,
Magnussen ble drepen etter å ha blitt påført
23-year-old Martine Vik Magnussen was found partially buried in the basement.
I'm Noelle El-Makafi, and I've been following this story since Martina was killed, making a promise to Martina's family to find out what happened and find the only suspect in the case. Farouk Abdelhak.
Leave me a message and I'll get back to you.
He's never been questioned by the police. Nobody's been able to speak to him. Until now. Murder in Mayfair. You can listen to the whole story now. Search for the documentary wherever you get your BBC podcasts.